Welcome to Insight class, where First Presbyterian's identity, faith, and values meets today's world. We are obviously doing this on Zoom, as we have been for some time, and we're recording, and we'll be placing the recording of this class on YouTube. So we now have many months of classes on available off the church's website for Insight classes. Today is April the 25th, 2021, and we are in the midst of a series on social changes and how they impact different aspects of our society. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Don Damsteegt, who's going to talk about social changes and how they influence interpersonal relations. Don is a part of Family Psychology Associates and a longtime member at Westminster as well, right down the street. So welcome, Don. Looking forward to the class. Our church service starts at 10 o'clock, so we have kind of a hard stop at maybe 10 minutes, for sure 5 minutes before the hour, so people have a chance to get coffee and go to the service. And it goes as long as it goes, but that's kind of the longest it can go. But again, welcome, Don, and thanks for joining us, and take it away.
Okay. Well, my plan is to share the screen with you in a few minutes, and I created an outline of what are some positive effects of changes that have occurred and what are some negative effects, just some thoughts that I've had. And then I want to open it up and have you talk about what your experiences are and what you found to be positive or negative about the 21st century. One other comment, since Tom is here and since we mentioned Westminster, Tom taught a class at Westminster about 4 or 5 years ago on his research on the book of Esther. And he said that helped to kind of formulate his thinking about what he was going to do in his dissertation at Harvard. And my name, Westminster's name, I guess Westminster, not me, not mine, is in the acknowledgments of his dissertation at Harvard in the Harvard Library. So just an interesting tidbit. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you, and then we'll talk for a little bit, and then we can have a general discussion. Can you see that all right? Is that okay? Okay. I know it's probably not large enough print and it's too many words, so let me kind of just sort of read it, and then we'll have you have a reaction as you want to. It might be good if you just let me talk for a few minutes and get through this, and then we can have a general discussion. So the topic here is 21st century society has changed and is still rapidly changing, and how has this changed our everyday lives, and what profound changes are predicted for the future? And that's your whole series, and mine is interpersonal relations. So in an attempt to spark some thinking, I asked my counselors at my agency and a staff meeting to come up with ideas. So some of these ideas are what they came up with. Social media is certainly one of the big changes that has occurred in the 21st century. And so, some examples of how that's positive, more creativity. People mentioned, for example, that they could, post things on TikTok, and probably not my generation so much, but the younger people use that a lot. Certainly, it's possible to have more social connections, talking with people online, having more friends, accessing information. Whoever uses an encyclopedia anymore, you just go to Google. In terms of relationships, there are dating and friendship apps, I understand. I have not used them very much myself, but Somebody mentioned that there is a thing called Bumble, which I'm not aware of, but that you can meet people more easily for dating. Zoom, we're doing Zoom right now. In my family, who is spread around the eastern part of the United States, we've had Zoom family meetings since about a year ago. And so we've met together more than we have in 20 years because of monthly Zoom meetings, and then book club meetings, and so on and so on. Certainly safer to do social media than it is to be in person when we've had the pandemic. It's possible to travel virtually. Someone mentioned that they had been recently visiting the Louvre Museum in Paris. And like Theater Cedar Rapids offers live concerts. Some of the negatives of social media use, probably a greater sense of vulnerability. We're constantly seeing images, not only on TV, but everywhere across the internet about everything that's going wrong. Ever since 9/11, we've felt more vulnerable. Greater prejudice against the stranger. Don't trust people. We don't know them personally. And if you have interaction personally with someone, you get to know them. But as long as they're just a group of strangers, we feel more vulnerable and don't trust them. For younger people, bullying. You hear a lot about young people who are bullied by their peers, for how they look or something about them. Counselors deal with that all the time. The assumption of availability. That means that young people will assume that they can just contact somebody anytime, and they can be upset if the person doesn't respond right away. And then personal comparisons, of course, people always report all the good things that are happening to them, and they don't report the bad things. And so it seems like, in comparison, my life is not very good. Spouses have trackers on phones. Certainly the greater polarization politically, all of the tweets and negative posts, fighting online, people fighting on Facebook. In terms of relationships, maybe not learning face-to-face communication skills. One counselor, for example, said she had I believe a 13-year-old son who was terrified of ordering something in a restaurant. Just didn't know how to order something because almost everything they do is online. Not knowing how to read other people's nonverbal communication because you're just not seeing the full person on screen. Hooking up, just finding sexual partners is not a positive thing in terms of long-term relationships. The illusion of connectedness. So one person mentioned a teenager they knew who had 2,500 friends. Well, they're not really friends. So they feel connected, but they're really disconnected. They don't know these people. And so they have less emotional involvement, makes people feel disposable. Like I can always find somebody new if you don't work out. Probably less commitment to an institution, like to a marriage, to a church, to a company. We often hear about the millennials who don't, have commitment to their jobs or any other institution. Greater risk of exploitation, predators, find kids online, lonely adults. Every once in a while, we have a client who has been pulled in by some con artist. They start talking online. The person starts asking for money, and so the vulnerable person then starts giving them money, and then before long, they start threatening them. If you don't give me money now, I'm going to tell your employer what you've been doing. And so they're really trapped. It's very hard to get out of those situations. And then I thought maybe we should just talk about some other aspects other than just social media. Education, virtual education during the pandemic has certainly been a positive thing in terms of allowing a lot of kids to keep on going to school, keep on learning, even though not in person. And then, in terms of what's going to happen in the future, the Cedar Rapids Gazette just a couple days ago on the 23rd had a headline, CR Virtual Academy expands. So there's a new school option called the Virtual Academy, and it's going to be permanent, not just temporary while the pandemic is on. And the article said they were hoping to have as many as 400 students next year. In terms of negatives about education, Time Magazine a few weeks ago was saying that learning is harder without in-person teachers. Students feel more isolated. Fewer are going to college directly out of school. And I think also in that category, we might say fewer kids are in sports, not doing outdoor activities as much because they're on their social media. One counselor shared that on the way to work one day, she had passed an elementary school where she observed that elementary students were out there on their cell phones instead of interacting with one another. So, that's again, not teaching how to interact with others correctly. In terms of psychology or medicine, a positive would certainly be virtual medicine, virtual psychotherapy. We can do it mask-free. It's often very helpful. We started in our agency, we started doing that in about April of last year. And we continue to do it. Probably at least half of our clients or more are seen still virtually. Especially this is helpful for people out of town. So I can work with somebody in Mason City without them having to travel all the way to Cedar Rapids. And, we send out reminders by text instead of phone calls. And so that's really helpful. On the negative side, maybe less ability to receive and understand nonverbal messages. So there is some loss when you're talking with people on Zoom versus in person in terms of just the subtle aspects of communication, including body language and so on. One other thing I was going to say, kind of in general here that I missed earlier was I've been doing some reading in a book club that I'm in about racial issues, and so we've been reading this book, Caste, and probably some of you have. So I'm becoming more woke, more aware of the realities of life that we've never really become aware of so much. And so that's a good thing. The bad thing about it is that we also are more stressed because we can't just assume that the old realities are ongoing and that everything's going to be okay. Phones, more cell phone use, less landline use, and that's fine. We can get texts and so on our phones. We don't use phone books as much, so it's harder to actually find someone's number or address. But a positive is that we can talk while we're traveling. We can easily communicate from an airport or even while driving, which is not such a good idea. And we rely on Google instead of the phone book. Gambling, I just mentioned. There was just recent legislation of gambling. And so now we're flooded with all of these gambling ads on TV, which I really, we wish would go away.
Yeah.
And there's the potential then for more gambling addiction. And in the past, it was never allowed because of the danger of sports stars being compromised. I think of the Chicago Black Sox all these years ago, or Pete Rose even in our lifetime. What about the future? Well, I think there's going to be a continuing influence of media. Electronic communication is going to continued access to information, continued ability to communicate widely. On the negative side, continuing influence of media. So, electronic communication leads to more isolation, more mistrust, more loneliness. Even though you have 2,500 friends, you can easily be lonely because there's nobody that you're close to. people who are not savvy with tech are going to be left behind even more. And, mental health issues might well worsen, especially if you are doing the comparison of yourself to other people and so on. What about for the church? On the positive side, more ability to connect virtually, have classes like this, may allow churches to find new ways to reach out to other people, and less need to meet in person as a negative. I think a lot of churches are not going to have people come back in the same way they were before. And that might also hasten the decline of the church or in attendance and in membership. So those are just some ideas that I've had. I'm going to stop the share and throw it open to the group to discuss. What do you see as the positive or negative influences of changes that have occurred in the 21st century?
I think that's a great list, but before trying to answer your question, I wonder if I could ask you a question about it, which is,
okay,
which of you see people in a therapy setting, which of these issues do you see any of those issues being reflected in the kind of therapy that you're doing? You made an allusion to one of them, but are you seeing an uptick in gambling cases or an uptake in, well, I'll leave it at that. Is it resonating with you, sort of your actual practical experience?
no, I haven't really seen a change in what kinds of problems people have.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
People always are struggling with depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress and substance abuse and relationship problems. They're just, they've always been the same.
I have a question, and Tom, maybe you can jump in on this as well. In the past, historically, church attendance and church membership has increased at times of great social upheaval. World War I, the Depression, followed by the World War II. Do we have yet any data on what's happening with church attendance, either virtual or in person, or membership as a result of the pandemic? Do we know how this is going to play out?
Are you directing your comment to Tom Wetzel?
Well, either of you.
Okay. I don't know, Tom, do you have any ideas about that?
Excuse me. It's funny you should mention that. I just saw a recent. I'm part of I'm Roman Catholic, and I'm part of a Renew My Church movement. They're looking at consolidating parishes in the Archdiocese of Chicago, where I am, and that already answers part of your question. They actually sped up the consolidation of parishes in the Catholic Church in the Archdiocese of Chicago because they're worried about that attendance is down. We still have limits on gathering. The parish I'm in can only have 50 people at a mass, at a service. And they have not made that up online with Facebook or what have you. The more troubling thing that they're worried about is in terms of millennials. So millennials would be, they're not the students who just left college for me. That would be the youngest side of the millennials. So I think into their early 30s. Is that right, Don? That age group, 20s and 30s right now would be millennials?
I think about that, yeah.
Yeah. The most recent survey of Catholic millennials who were going to mass prior to the pandemic, so leaving aside the whole group who never went to church once they got confirmed, a third of them have said they're not coming back to mass after the pandemic. A third of the people who were going to mass. So it's a huge drop that they're expecting. And that's actually why the Archdiocese, they said, we have to assume that there's going to be at least a good 10 to 15% of people who won't come back to churches after the pandemic. So I think what you're suggesting, this seems very different from past crises, national crises. Yeah, at least that's anecdotal for the Archdiocese of Chicago and the Catholic Church in general, but I suspect that's relatively similar lines.
Thank you.
Well, and that just is exacerbating a trend that was going on for a long time. You know, churches have been in decline for a long time. And this is maybe just hastening that a bit more.
On the positive side, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Don.
On the positive side, this may allow for new ways to do church. You know, more outreach to people who you know, could participate virtually in a class on Romans or something like that without having to be present.
Or I was going to mention from my own experience, we've started a prayer group at my parish, and it started with 3 people, and it's already up to, we were averaging 12 and would have a height of 16 or 17, many of them coming precisely because it was Zoom. They were parishioners who couldn't make it to Mass, either because of physical disabilities or age or distance or something like that. And so we actually have a prayer community, and it was only going to last a few weeks. And some of them said, I need this to keep going, which is a really, so that's a very hopeful moment that there's new ways to sort of build church structures. But still, I think, as you said, Don, there's that weird aspect, we aren't actually together. Yeah.
Well, and I think some of the together thing is not going to happen for a while yet until people are really feeling safe. You know, even now, if we're together, we're supposed to be 6 feet apart and, you know, blocking off rows, so you're only in every other row, and so it's not the same as greeting each other with a hug or a handshake or whatever. What about others of you? What have your experiences been with changes in this century? What do you want to share?
I think most of us are hoping to get back to somewhat normality, whether we ever will or not. But I mean, I see people at the Sunday evening meal program, volunteers, who it's so nice to see one another again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The pandemic has really caused a lot of isolation, hasn't it?
And I think that as far as worship experiences, it's just not the same on Zoom. I know our pastor has worked hard to be as creative as possible, and she's done a beautiful job, but it's just still impersonal.
Yeah. Rosemary, you were starting to say something, but you're muted, so you need to unmute yourself.
A broadband. I think the internet has kind of divided people and families, you know, and so we have to make sure that we provide access to the internet to everyone. I'm thinking about the elderly and in nursing homes, the pandemic. Wow, that was really terrible. My mother was there, so that's why I say that. So it's just an essential life skill that you know how to use a computer. And there's many people in our society that don't, especially the elderly, very elderly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
My experience there is that that generation, and I'm talking now about my parents' generation, my mother-in-law's generation, they will never learn to use a computer. They have no interest in learning to use a computer. That reluctance or inability will gradually diminish over time. Time has a great way of removing the reluctant, but it's just not going to happen. We've talked about this in our worship and music committee meeting. How do we get those people involved? And the answer we've come to is we don't. They won't use computers. They won't use iPads. Most of them, if they have a cell phone at all, it's a basic flip phone sort of thing. We just have to recognize that as long as the pandemic is around, they're not going to be involved, which is too bad.
Mhm.
There isn't anything we can do about it, I don't think. It does seem to be coming to an end. Those are now the people who are most vaccinated,
Mhm.
and will be, I'm sure, the first to return to in-person service. But until we can do that, we just have to recognize that we can't involve them.
Right.
And we developed a habit now too. You know, it's been going on for so long that we just have a habit of wearing masks. And we have a habit of not touching people and, you know, staying away from gatherings. And so once you develop a new habit, then you continue to do that unless there's a reason to change that in some way. So there's going to be some permanent changes, I think, in the direction of being more isolated.
I think it was interesting what you said, Don. First of all, I loved your list. It seemed like a great list, and I was struck by how every one of those topics could be a entire hour just spent just talking about one of those topics. I was trying to think about things that weren't on your, that maybe that potentially additional sort of things, and
Yeah.
and I was trying to think about, it seems like the speed of society is faster now. At least that's my perception. And I've heard people say that it's maybe the conventional wisdom. And I wondered if that would be something that is influencing the kind of people that you see in the therapy setting. Is it the case that our society is fundamentally faster and less moored than it was some years ago, or is that just my perception?
Well, that's a good question. Anyone could respond to that. There certainly is a heavier emphasis on doing things and being busy all the time, and then the anxiety that comes with that. So a common thing that we do in therapy is called mindfulness training. And mindfulness means just practicing being present, just taking a little time to focus on your breath, just taking time to just be aware of everything you see around you or experience, instead of just constantly be on the go and not being centered. It's kind of a centering thing, which is often helpful for lots of people, and it opens up some possibility for change of stuck patterns. I don't know what the rest of you think. Is there something about that, about the pace of society that is difficult now, more difficult?
I guess I feel that society has slowed down for me.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any haste whatever. I have to work to keep constructively busy during the day because I have no company. I live by myself, as do lots of other people. And I have to consciously make an effort to have positive things in my mind.
I don't know anything about your situation, but I'm just going to build on what you said. A lot of people are suffering with depression because they don't have enough socialization, connection to people, things that are interesting to them. They're just too much time alone and too much time to think and to ponder what they've lost. And so it's easy to become depressed when you're isolated. So a kind of a standard therapeutic strategy would be to get people more active. It's called behavioral activation, helping them to brainstorm what they could do instead of just do nothing. And that's harder in these days when you're isolated. I agree.
I guess I worry about the younger set who doesn't know how to socialize, how much time they've lost with all this interaction, and what kind of results are going to happen once they do get back together. Like, do they know what it's like to compromise, for instance, as opposed to just exploding?
Mhm.
And to make a commitment to a relationship that you keep working on, even though there are times when it doesn't feel very good.
One thing I've seen, in my classes at Loyola, and this started even before the pandemic, and I saw this when I was emerging already, excuse me, already when I was at Mount Mercy several years ago. When I first started teaching, the students would all come into class, and whether they liked the class or not, they were all chatting together, and they were all doing, they were talking about what they were going to do that weekend, or, some of them were reviewing for class, or just, sort of that day-to-day conversation.
Mhm.
And over the years, more and more of them come and sit down and take out their phone and just start looking at their phone, and the classrooms are completely silent. And now I see, since we moved, because we're still teaching via Zoom at Loyola, most of our courses, the students log in and immediately turn off their screens and their microphones at the beginning of class. So yeah, relating to what you're saying about learning how to socialize, there's a real skill to just learning how to chat with someone for a few minutes before something starts, right? It's a really interesting skill that they've lost, because some of my students right now haven't been in a classroom for a year and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, you think about that in terms of development. Don, you can probably address that much better. To lose that from 17 and a half to 20 or whatever is probably pretty shocking, right? In terms of your social integration.
Yeah, huge amount of learning that happens in those first 3 years of the late teens, early 20s. Yeah.
And they lose the ability to, they don't lose the ability to make friends. They just don't make friends. That's how friendships form, is just idle chat. If you don't have that idle chat before class, I was noticing that at Co even before I retired, which was long before the pandemic, that, as you said, Tom, students come in, they're already on their phones when they come in, and they sit down and they continue that conversation, and they're completely oblivious of the people who are on either side of them. Yeah.
I have a funny anecdote to share. Marcia and I were out at a restaurant about 2-3 months ago, and someone took a phone call and they put it on speaker. And so, here we're hearing, their conversation with their family, and we're, I don't know, 5-10 yards away. And, I kind of, we sort of said something about, I don't know what, and then they glared at us. And then when they left, they came over and sort of lectured us. You should just stay home if you don't want to be here. Well, you're the one who's making noise here. But, the thing that I think Tom brought up about turning off your screens, I have another friend who's also a college professor, and he had the same report that their colleges do not have a policy that you have to keep your screen on because of a privacy thing. Because, maybe someone's in a setting where they don't want others to see where they live, for example. And so you can't force someone to have their phone or their screen on live. But then in that case, you don't know if they are really in the class or not. They could be out mowing the lawn and the camera's just running. And so you don't have the same accountability then. You can't just call on somebody if you notice that they seem to be not paying attention. So that's a problem. I was telling Matt earlier that I just finished a 2-day training in a therapy technique, and it was nationwide. So there were like 150 people, and so there's multiple screens like this. And as I scrolled across the screens, about half of them were just blank. So here's this national speaker doing a training, and most people have their screens off. Now, I don't know if they were really listening and paying attention, or they're just wanting their CEUs. I don't know what was going on.
Yeah, this Leland. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, we can hear you, Leland.
I don't know where my screen is, but yeah, one of the things that a couple things what Tom mentioned, Zoom doesn't give you the opportunity for that idle chat before or after a meeting, and that's so important. You know, develop those relationships, new ideas, new connections. And the other thing I'm amazed is it's difficult to have any people can't be still anymore and not have anything to do because you take out that phone. You know, there's no room for just quiet space. People can be walking, walking their dog, and a lot of times people have the phone on, or just anytime there's a moment for by yourself, you pull out the phone. And I don't know, and so I wonder about having stillness, I guess, and not having anything to do, and knowing that's okay. That's a big challenge.
Yes. If I go to a doctor and I have to wait for 5 minutes, I'm on my phone checking or playing solitaire or checking the news or whatever. And one of the things that would frighten me is if I were put in prison, they probably wouldn't let me have a phone, and I would have all this empty time with nothing to do.
Don't go to prison.
I try not to. I'm real careful.
So now I have a question. I don't know how many years ago it was, decades. I just got in the habit of always having a book or a newspaper or a magazine with me. And if I had 5 minutes, 10 minutes to kill, I would just read. And it didn't make any difference if it was the doctor's office or waiting for a train, or you remember trains, waiting for an airplane, anything. I just take out whatever I had to read, and I would read for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour. Is that any different from the people who today pull out their phone and play solitaire or check their email or whatever? Is my behavior actually that much different from other people?
Well, good question. And maybe others would have an opinion. My first thought is that yes, it is different, because when you're reading, you're absorbed in what you're doing. And I suppose if you were playing a game of solitaire or reading a news story, you might get absorbed in it. But I think especially with a novel, you kind of lose awareness of what's going on around you, and you're really connected to the story. It causes you to calm down and be more peaceful. Again, just talking off the top of my head, I don't know if others would have that same opinion.
So today, in this day and age, my reading tends increasingly to be on the iPad. I'm still reading. I'm still reading the same novel or newspaper or magazine, whatever it would have been, but it's on my iPad instead of on paper. Now, does that change the dynamic at all? The fact that I can, and often do, especially if I'm reading a nonfiction piece and they're using terminology that I find unfamiliar or mention a place that sounds interesting, I Google it. Is my behavior now different again because I have the opportunity to interact with my electronic media?
Don't you think a lot of it's a difference of where you are and with whom you are? If you're all by yourself sitting at the airport waiting, you can use any kind of media. But if you're among a group and supposedly you're supposed to interact, but there you are pulling out your iPhone, I think that's a totally different concept.
Mm-hmm.
I agree, but I don't think we're talking about, well, I don't know. Classmates, that's a different dynamic again. Different from being by yourself at the doctor's office or waiting with a bunch of strangers for a plane, where you don't know anybody and presumably you have nothing in common except for the fact that you're all waiting for the same thing in the same place. Now, I know people who will take that opportunity to actually talk to the people beside them, complete strangers, but they'll strike up a conversation. That's something that I think, that's a skill that I think is rapidly disappearing.
If I could say though, on the other side of that, it sometimes really irritates me when they have a chatty Cathy who wants to talk and talk about nothing, and I just want to have some silence.
Yes.
A lot of times at Cove, I notice they're calling their parents all the time, in touch with their parents. And the parents didn't discourage that. And maybe that's a little too much contact with parents when they're supposed to be more on their own.
Are those the helicopter parents who, without the cell phone, would have been putting in an appearance on campus every weekend?
Oh, don't get me started on them.
Yeah.
But you've seen them. They flood out of the buildings when the classes are over, and they're all on their phones. The minute that door opens, they're on their phones.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's accessibility and it's omnipresent. You could be walking around the lake, or you could be, it's that accessibility, I think, is what makes it different than before, to information and talking, or, you can do it everywhere at any time.
So since that is the case, what is the implication of that? What do you see? What are the what is the outcome of such constant communication by phone and not in person?
I think a lot of the concern is the one-sidedness of the information that people access.
Mhm.
You read what you want to read,
Mhm.
as opposed to multiple news sources and so on. And I think it's narrowing our outlook on a lot of things.
Yeah, so that's maybe some of the polarization that we see in our country now politically is people only watch the news sources that they agree with.
Mhm.
Seems like there's a difference between, I'll call them producers and consumers in this, especially in this electronic world. Some people are just exclusively consumers of things and wandering around the internet, etc. But some people are actually producing. They're producing videos and they're producing software and they're producing other things. And that seems like a very positive development. And most of us are somewhere in between, right? Do some producing, some consuming. But it feels like there's a measure of healthiness in these interactions that can be measured by how much you're actually contributing, as opposed to just consuming.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that idea, Matt. So you learn more if you actually participate, raise your hand, share an opinion, get feedback. If you just sort of passively take in, you don't learn as much. Yeah. and, okay.
The development of Wikipedia, just to give one example, or the development of open source software, or those are all enabled by this free communication and effectively free storage that's provided by the technical advances, and it's a wonderful development.
Mhm.
The creativity of YouTube, again, just picking one example, is astonishing to me, and development of free operating systems that are just being done by people on a volunteer basis, for example, is amazing.
Mhm.
Well, and that also causes more stress, at least in my life, because I like to stay up on things. I like to learn new things. And there's so many opportunities. And then I say, well, I really want to take advantage of that. But then that means that I've got to try to master something new, instead of saying, well, no, that conference would be over in Colorado. I'm not going to go there. And so I feel more pressure to participate in learning things, even though I don't, even though it stresses me.
Mhm.
So now I'm sitting here and I'm imagining the world in 1455, the year after Gutenberg creates movable type. And I'm thinking, were they having similar conversations then? Gee, the kids are wandering around and their faces are just buried in books and they're not talking to me. Is it just that we're in a time when, whether we like it or not, new forms of communication are developing, and we need to be cognizant of it, but we don't necessarily need to stop it. It's something that will change us fundamentally over time, but it's not necessarily a bad thing.
No, in a way it can make you, I think of YouTube this weekend. I'm studying YouTube videos on how to lay vinyl plank floors in my kitchen. And what a great source that is. Yes, it makes me be more independent, so it's how you use it, I think.
And I think that's what I was getting at with the students and the parents. Just at a time when the students are to be learning to fly by themselves, they're still connected to their parents, maybe more so when they were living under the same roof.
Well, and could that be a sign that they are anxious about actual communication with their peers?
Sure.
Hey, Don, we've only got like a minute or two left. And so maybe there's time for one more question, but I would like to hijack for just a second and say that the church is considering how to reinstitute live services and live adult education and other kinds of classes. And so I would appreciate it if anybody that has an opinion about whether they'd be interested in the coming months of attending an Insight class live, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. Any kind of feedback people have about that, whether they'd be interested in attending live classes. And then second, if they'd be interested in a virtual option as we go forward, it may be the case that in the coming months, we'll start thinking about having, again, live classes, but also available online over Zoom. We're trying to start thinking about those kinds of topics. So any opinions would be much appreciated. We were averaging 30, 35 people a year and a half ago for classes. We're now getting around a dozen people on our Zoom meetings, and then we record it, and then we'll typically get 5 to 10 people watch the entire class on Zoom. So we're maybe around 20 people. So trying to figure out how to accommodate different styles of interaction is it's going to be a challenge for us, but it's something that we're going to need to do. So yes, please.
You know how many watch it on YouTube?
What's that?
You know how many people view it on YouTube?
Yes, if you just look at how many people view it, you might think there's 20, 30, 40, sometimes even more. But if you actually look at the analytics, we're probably getting people that watch most of the class, anywhere between 5 and 15. It really varies depending on probably the topic. So, so don't be, sometimes the views is more than 100, but that's an overestimate of how many people are actually spending a lot of time on it.
Mm-hmm.
But sorry for hijacking there, Don.
Well, no, that's fine. One last thing. Would you like me to share my list with you, Matt?
That would be great. I'll put a link to it on the YouTube recording so that people will have access to it. And I also selfishly was thinking that the committee that organizes these talks might use that to help us focus future classes, because you had so many interesting topics on that list. So yes, please, if you could email that to me, that would be great, Don. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine.
We really do have to kind of wrap up to let people get to the service. Don, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate your leading this class. We have next week, we're going to continue our discussion about social changes with Catherine Deming, who is a mental health counselor. And the week after that, we actually have changed the schedule. So we'll have an oncologist talking with us in 2 weeks. So you'll be seeing that as well, and as we continue our discussion about social changes. So again, thank you very much, Don, and look forward to seeing some of you in the service here coming up.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having me.
Bye, thanks.
Okay,
Thank
Hey,
you.
nice to meet you, Tom. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Don.
Yes, welcome.